as he was walking along?
No, the Queen Consort did. She wanted to know why he was off school. With a little grin.
Well, I think it's a reasonable excuse and something you're going to remember forever.
Yeah.
Well, thanks for speaking to us. The crowd's dispersing now. That magical moment now over here in Cardiff as the King leaves the Welsh capital.
We're taking you to Surrey, Pirbright, to be exact. The new Prince and Princess of Wales visiting an Army Training Centre to meet with troops from the Commonwealth who have been deployed to the UK to take part in the state funeral of Her Majesty the Queen on Monday, a state funeral involving thousands of troops from right around the Commonwealth. This is the Prince and Princess of Wales arriving a few moments ago. They'll be meeting soldiers from Canada, Australia and New Zealand who have been at that Army Training Centre rehearsing their roles in Monday's ceremony. Let's just listen in. The Prince and Princess are going to meet with senior representatives of the Defence staff and service people from each nation as well there in Surrey to thank them for the part that they will be playing on Monday and the part they have played so far in marking the death of Her Majesty the Queen. We did see the new Princess of Wales at Pirbright Army Training Centre not so long ago, actually. She took part in a training day herself to learn more about the armed forces. I think it was to mark Armed Forces Day. As she was there and we saw her literally being hands-on in some of the training exercises that troops undertake. It's important for the royal family to reach out to the military because, of course, the Queen and now the King, head of the Armed Forces.
Head of the Armed Forces, yes. And I think it's there that I saw Kate a few years ago presenting Shamrock to the Irish Guards. The relationship between the royal family and the military is pretty fundamental, and most of the Queen's children have some involvement in the armed forces, and we'll see that tonight, won't we, with the Vigil, with the wearing of the uniforms and so on. So it's always been paramount right way through from the Queen serving with the ATS at the end of World War II, and Prince Philip serving throughout the war.
And amongst the royals have a number of different military titles. Just some news that we've had into us here on Sky News this afternoon. There was a lot of talk about the vigil that's going to take place this evening involving the Queen's children and, of course, the vigil taking place tomorrow evening involving her grandchildren. But we understand from the Palace that Prince Andrew has been given dispensation to wear military uniform at this evening's vigil. But there's no confirmation as to whether he will or not. There has been a lot of talk about that, and Prince Harry as well, because both of them no longer having those military titles, but perhaps wanting to wear their uniforms as they have served.
Well, absolutely, and I think the main thing is that the royal family won't want a talking point, because once the funeral's over on Monday, there's going to be analysis for the next week, 2 weeks or whatever. Talking points, people saying, well, it was all right, but did you see that bit where, you know, they're lying in state and they didn't wear a uniform, something like that. It's important to show solidarity and not to give a kind of... and also perhaps not to give Harry the excuse of, you know, one day saying I wanted to wear a uniform and I wasn't allowed or something. We don't want that kind of thing that takes away from the solemnity of the occasion.
No, well, it sounds like they will be given permission to, at their own personal discretion, to make that decision as to what they want to wear. Ian Lloyd, royal biographer, thank you for the moment.
Sarah Jane, thank you. These are live pictures from Cardiff of the King and Queen Consort. They left the castle here a few moments ago. They're now pulling up at the helicopter for that journey back to London. And I have to say the crowds here are absolutely delighted. They'd queued from the early hours of this morning to get into the castle. Only 2,000 were allowed in, and they were hoping that the King would walk along the line and say hello to as many of them as possible, and he and his wife did just that, and people now are slowly going home with many memories, many recollections and many thoughts of what they've just experienced on what is a momentous day, the very first trip to Wales for the new king, King Charles III. And joining me now is Professor Elizabeth Treasure, who is Vice-Chancellor of Aberystwyth University. Lovely to see you, Professor. First of all, can I just remark on your name? I mean, it's quite the name to have right now, isn't it?
It's a fantastic name, yes. Thank you very much. I'm very proud of it.
Elizabeth Treasure.
Yeah.
Wonderful. Well, we're watching pictures, Professor, of the king leaving Cardiff. What do you make of the reception he's received?
Hasn't it been a warm reception on this strange day of such mixed emotions? Bidding farewell to his mother and a super service this morning in the cathedral. And then this fantastic crowd, really pleased to see him this afternoon. And why not? Because he loves Wales.
And you're the Vice-Chancellor, as we've said, of Aberystwyth University, somewhere that holds a special place in the King's heart.
Yeah, he came to Aberystwyth before the investiture, just over 50 years ago, to learn Welsh. And we've seen him using his Welsh today, which is fantastic. He studied for 10 weeks, the language, the culture, the history, under the late Professor Teddy Millward. Many people around the world have seen it on The Crown. And he lived in a hall of residence alongside other students and had, as far as we can tell, a good time there learning Welsh.
And he spoke, as you say, Welsh today when he gave his response to that motion of condolence. I don't speak Welsh, but it seemed to me like he did a pretty good job. How do you rate it?
He did a pretty good job. I'm a learner. It's not an easy language to speak in public. It's quite scary. And I thought he did a pretty good job today. So well done him for learning lessons of the last 50 years.
And I think that time at Aberystwyth in 1969, is that
That's
right?
correct.
Will have put him in good stead, because it shows that he made a real effort to learn about this wonderful country. He made an effort to learn the language, and he didn't necessarily have to do that, but he did it because he knew that this was a role he wanted to take seriously.
Yeah, I think it's really important. I think people forget how important the language is to the people of Wales, how many people use it as their first language.
How many is it?
It's about 20%, and where I live in Ceredigion, it's around half the people it is their first language. My office is first language Welsh. And I think what was important there was that he lived with Welsh speakers who wanted to live their life through the medium of Welsh. And joined in. So we have a student who's an alumnus who's put on Facebook how strange to share the same cleaner, Mrs. Brandon, as the then Prince of Wales. So he really engaged.
Because he wasn't in a separate turret at the castle, he wasn't in the grounds, he was mucking in with the other students.
He had a room. I think there was also a room for security, but he had his room, which people still point out as the Prince's room.
And you met the King, the former Prince of Wales, of course, not so long ago.
I did. He came to Aberystwyth. He's come back to Aberystwyth several times. But he came in November to mark the opening of the first veterinary school in Wales, in Aberystwyth. And what struck me very much was how much time he spent talking to every one of the students. He was really interested and engaged. He also talked to the staff about the environment, about the problems we face in rural life, and he showed his interest in the university and rural life in the United Kingdom.
Not everyone in this country is a fan of the monarchy. The Prince of Wales has a long and checkered history, of course, that title. Where do you think we go now in this big moment of transition? What will the relationship between the monarchy and the country be?
That's a really hard question.
It's a tough one, I appreciate.
It's a tough one, and today I think when we're looking past to such a fantastic life of service from Her Majesty the Queen and now forwards to King Charles III, we live in a democracy. No doubt it will pan out as the people want, but I think it's going to be a debate that will continue to roll, but for the moment we're celebrating the new King and remembering Her late Majesty.
And the Queen was held in huge affection here.
She was, and again, I've met her in Cardiff, again engaging with students and the young and the future, and really inspiring students in those meetings by being interested in their work. And I have immense respect for her in that role, and also in her role as a woman leader.
I've spoken to lots of young people over the last week, and touching on what you said there, we know that the Prince of Wales, as he was fairly opinionated. He had strong views on lots of different things, but one of those things was the environment, wasn't it? And although in his new role he won't be able to give those opinions in public in the same way, I think a lot of young people and a lot of students at Aberystwyth will appreciate that, and it's something that they will see as a good thing in the new monarchy.
I think so. I think what this generation are so concerned about is climate change, is the environment. And I think when we see what's happening in Pakistan just at the moment, you can absolutely see how absolutely critical it is that we do address the environmental issues. And the universities in Wales, Aberystwyth, but the others as well, are all addressing some of those really important questions. We do a lot of work on future food security, something that's absolutely critical at the moment.
Well, as we watch pictures of the King leaving Cardiff, flying off back to London in the helicopter, we can reflect really on what a remarkable day it's been. It's been a whistle-stop tour really of Cardiff. He's seen the main landmarks, hasn't he? He's been to beautiful Llandaff Cathedral. He's been to that very modern building down by the waterside, the Senedd, where the Parliament sits, and then here at the castle, 2,000 years of history here, Professor. And of course, this was a day that was planned meticulously.
Absolutely. Every detail covered, from the first moment of arriving in the car park, watching him arriving in his helicopter, taking off just now. What a fantastic job everybody involved in that has done. I think we should just be incredibly grateful for a fantastic day. People have worked so hard, all the people of Cardiff and beyond.
It is a great city, isn't it? It's really been shown its very best light today. And I was going to ask you as well about the crowds that turned out, because there had been some talk that perhaps people would be a little bit ambivalent about the visit today, but I've been really struck by the huge numbers that have turned out.
I only saw crowded streets. I saw very little other than celebration and memory today. And on this beautiful day, as you say, around the castle, in this historic site. What a fantastic day for Wales, and how good of him to come at what must be personally a very, very difficult time.
And do you think you'll see the King in Aberystwyth anytime soon? Have you extended an invitation yet? Maybe a bit too early?
A bit too early. Inappropriate at the moment, but we do hope to maintain that relationship with us as one of our former students. He's been very generous to us with his time over the years, and I hope that he will come again. And if not, we will no doubt welcome the new principal.
Well, it certainly sounds like it's going from strength to strength, the university.
Thank you, it is, yeah.
Lovely to see you, Professor Elizabeth Treasure. Wonderful name at this very sad time. Vice-Chancellor, Aberystwyth University. Thank you, great to see you, much appreciated. Well, we are watching pictures from a little bit earlier of the King greeting the crowds here at Cardiff Castle. As I was saying, they had waited many hours to get into the grounds here and meet the King, and their wishes were granted. And it's really struck me today just how grateful the King seems that so many people have turned out to meet him and offer their condolences. He's been receiving gifts, flowers, and the like from them. It's not been sorrowful. In fact, I would say it's been almost the opposite. It's been a day of joy for these people. I'm grateful that they've managed to see the King on his first day in Wales as monarch. But of course now things do turn for Charles. He's taken that helicopter ride back to London. And what today has been a day of meeting and greeting with not only members of the public, but of course the great and the good of Cardiff and Wales, people from many faiths, people from charities, politicians from the Senedd as well. Well, now things change somewhat. The mood, the tone will become much more sombre. And to tell us why is our royal correspondent, Laura Bundock. That helicopter making its way back to the capital, Laura.
Where the King, alongside his siblings, his two brothers and sister, will at 7:30 this evening hold another vigil around the coffin of the Queen inside Westminster Hall. We saw the same vigil, didn't we, on Monday evening at St Giles Cathedral in Edinburgh. And after an incredibly busy week, and I think just the events of today reflect how frantic it has been for the King, touring the nations, meeting and greeting the spiritual, the political and the people as well. And certainly the people who are here in Cardiff, they'd been on their feet since 6 o'clock this morning. They didn't want to miss a trick of this visit. But tonight, as I think the King heads back to London, thoughts will obviously turn to the state funeral on Monday, and what will be another very poignant moment, I think, inside Westminster Hall as we see the vigil. And of course, over the weekend, heads of state arriving, tens and tens of them, into London with a huge reception for them on Sunday night at the Palace, hosted by the King and Queen Consort.
OK, Laura, thank you very much indeed. Our royal correspondent Laura Bundock there, reflecting on events of this evening as we reflect on events of today, watching King Charles as he slowly works his way along that line. Less than half an hour ago, meeting children who've taken the day off school for this momentous occasion, meeting people from all ages, all walks of life, all wanting to be here to pay their respects. We must remember that behind the smiles, behind the cheers, behind the flag waving, behind the costumes that some people are wearing is a man very much in mourning, a man grieving the loss of his mother. And I'm sure as he continues his journey in that helicopter, his thoughts will turn to what are bound to be an incredibly difficult few days as we watch those rehearsals, we see those plans that have been in place for so long being put into action, culminating in Monday's state funeral of Queen Elizabeth II.
Well, the King now heading back to London. His Majesty will host a reception for faith leaders in the Bowroom at Buckingham Palace a little later on. And then this evening, His Majesty will depart Buckingham Palace to head there to Westminster Hall. He and his siblings, the Duke of York, the Princess Royal and the Earl of Wessex, are to hold a vigil in Westminster Hall, much like we saw them carry out in Edinburgh. These are live pictures inside Westminster Hall. You can see a member of the police there paying their respects as the public file past. Thousands.
of a senior member of the royal family. When Diana died, because she wasn't a member of the royal family, there wasn't. The royal family didn't come out and mark the occasion publicly, and there was trouble. But I remember when Princess Margaret died, the Queen carried out engagements, and I was at one, and we were told, and the public was told, not to mention the fact that Princess Margaret had died, because the Queen wanted to, I think, to protect herself and not to break down or be involved. So this is very different, isn't it? I mean, people the royal family are closely involved. There was hugging with the Countess of Wessex in Manchester, and with Kate yesterday leading a small child over the barriers to put flowers down. It's a very touchy-feely sort of approach, and helping, as we said earlier, to share the grief, a joint thing. We're helping them. I think they're helping us over this time of still a shock for many people, I think.
Well, we can see the Prince and Princess of Wales, they're talking to soldiers from Canada, Australia and New Zealand. All have been dispatched to Pirbright to rehearse their roles in the ceremony. They're taking their time to have those conversations with them. Unfortunately, we can't hear any of what is being said. The Prince and Princess are going on to meet senior representatives of the Defence Staff and service people from each nation to thank them all for the part that they will play in marking the death of Her Majesty the Queen. And those rehearsals continue while the conversations go on between the royals and the armed personnel. Ian, this weekend, heads of state, global world leaders, huge names will be heading to London for the state funeral on Monday. We understand the Prime Minister Liz Truss will be holding informal meetings to greet them and welcome them to the UK as part of that, as will the King himself. In terms of the funeral on Monday, it's interesting, isn't it? We're hearing about great world leaders like President Biden and the Emperor of Japan having to get on buses to go to the funeral. President Biden being told he can't have his normal security detail with him. You know, this really does show the hierarchy in global world affairs, the monarch seemingly right at the top when it comes to this.
Yeah, I remember being outside Westminster Abbey for the Queen Mother's funeral, and it's quite funny. You see a coach, I think it was a local coach from Windsor, pull up, and then all these kings and queens get off. You know, there's it's quite a levelling experience for them, I'm sure, because they're all used to convoys of cars and so on. But yeah, the President of the United States is probably slumming it for the first time in his life, I would think, as leader. But it's a historical moment and a vast gathering of heads of state, and I wouldn't be surprised if there isn't some sort of group photograph taken, because it's such a marked occasion. Back in 1910, here at Buckingham Palace, when the Queen's great-grandfather, Edward VII, died, there was a great gathering of Europe's kings and queens on the eve almost of World War I. Later, many of those monarchies disappeared, but because it was such a vast gathering of royalty, there was a famous photograph taken of George V with the guests, including Kaiser Wilhelm II, his cousin, to mark that occasion. So it could be something similar this time.
Apologies for the movement there in the pictures. Our cameraman obviously being asked to move there as those military exercises, those rehearsals for Monday's state funeral continue. The Prince and Princess of Wales, they're talking to representatives from Commonwealth nations, Canada, Australia and New Zealand, who have come to Surrey to carry out those rehearsals ahead of Monday. Because, Ian, this is a global event. Millions of eyes will be on this state funeral. And it's important to get it right. This is a real show of not just the UK, but the Commonwealth.
Well, a great deal of planning has gone into it, and you're right, they won't want anything to go wrong. They won't want anybody snubbed, nobody to go home feeling that they didn't get a moment with the King or whatever it is. And you have to remember, of course, now that the King is King of Australia and New Zealand and Canada, and the Commonwealth is a vital part of his role as head of the Commonwealth. Back in 2015, the Queen in Malta asked the leaders of the Commonwealth if they would support, I suppose, Charles's role as head of head of the Commonwealth, which is not automatically a royal one. It could have gone to any of the leaders of the nations, but they did indeed vote him in as the next head of the Commonwealth. So it's he's not just the king of this country, but several others.
Yeah, we saw the Prime Minister of New Zealand, Jacinda Ardern, inside Westminster Hall earlier, paying her respects to the Queen. Jacinda Ardern saying that she will be meeting the King over the course of the weekend, although the timings are yet to be worked out. Just in terms of what we're seeing here, the Queen, obviously head of the armed forces, and so many members of the royal family have titles associated with the armed forces. And there is some talk about reallocation of titles and things like that. And a lot of people looking at the new Princess of Wales as to whether she may assume one at some point.
Yes, I mean, I think it's natural now with the passing of the Queen. We've got a considerable number of military appointments and roles that she was involved with that will need to be passed on. I remember that when the Queen Mother and Princess Margaret died, Prince Andrew said they had all the patronages that the two ladies were involved with on a card table at Sandringham, and they all went round as a family and sort of picked various ones that they felt appropriate for them, sort of. So there are a considerable number. I mean, the Queen was involved with something like 800 charities and patronages, and these will. Some of these will be given to the members of the royal family, particularly, as you say, Kate. Now she's Princess of Wales in a more significant role.
The Prince and Princess of Wales coming a little closer to the camera. You'll have to just excuse the movement there. Obviously, the press assembled there to try and catch a word with the Prince and Princess of Wales and to follow their visit, are being moved around to accommodate them. Let's listen in and see if we can hear something of what's being said.
You always want to learn Korean?
Not always. My father learned Japanese so the opportunity there to study
How difficult is Korean to learn? It's quite a hard language.
one of my friends, his partner is actually multilingual. She knows Japanese, Chinese, Spanish, and Korean, and she says that much.
Is there any space left in the brain after like 5 languages?
I was like, but yeah, so.
And have you been a part of any of these sort of Jubilee celebrations in the past, when you kind of been parade today? How are you finding it?
It's strange.
We're on travel, you guys, yeah, it's fantastic. How's all the drill going?
It's gone. Yeah, we're getting
When you see the pace stick come out, you start worrying.
yeah,
You're very serious about pace stick.
So may I present to you Lance Corporal Lucky Theo? And Lucky is a knight in Russell Leeds.
Really? Who do you support?
my paramedics.
Where are they from?
Paramedics.
And have you grown up watching rugby? And league, not league, for the myself? You guys did quite well at the rugby side. Was it playing the Blacks last week? It was King against the Blacks. Was it last week? I think so, recently. Give them a good run for their money. They're a bit too good. We'll be seeing it.
So may I present to you Venus Ewan Colonel Green? He's posted to our Australian Federation Guide.
The Prince and Princess of Wales in Surrey at the Army Training Centre in Pirbright to meet troops from the Commonwealth who have been deployed to the UK to take part in the state funeral of Her Majesty the Queen. They're taking their time to talk to those from Canada, New Zealand and Australia. Ian Lloyd, former royal photographer and royal biographer, in the studio with me watching these scenes. And Ian, you were commenting that New Zealand and Australia, the royal family tours there have been very successful. And there has been some talk in recent days of the new Prince and Princess of Wales being sent there soon on a royal tour to forge that relationship.
Absolutely,
further.
yes. I mean, the Queen went to Australia 16 times and New Zealand 10 times. In the early days, it was a vast undertaking. She had to go by sea, and she spent 5 or 6 months down there in 1953, 54. These days, it's obviously a lot easier to get there, but Camilla in particular, I think, finds the long-haul flights quite difficult. I think, given the age of the Waleses and the fact that certainly they're both very, very popular down there. I was by chance in the queue for the lying in state with a group of Australians who said they absolutely adore her there, Kate in particular, and they were looking forward to seeing her. And like with William and Harry when they were little, it's possible that they'll take the children with them and so on. So it's an important time, I think, to keep that relationship going with those countries.
We've seen the Prime Minister of New Zealand, Jacinda Ardern, in London today. She was inside Westminster Hall paying her respects to the late Queen, and in recent days she said, "I do not believe that New Zealand will become a republic in my lifetime." Such is the changing at the head of the royal family. The Queen becomes the king, and in modern times there are more questions being asked about the purpose of the Commonwealth in this modern era, and those are all questions that this new look royal family are going to have to try and answer over the coming years.
Well, I think as we've seen in the last few days and the week since the Queen died, that even the role of how we deal with the passing of a monarch is changing. So the nature of the relationship with the Commonwealth will change and be re-evaluated, I would imagine. And it's very much down to William and Kate and that generation, I think, to adapt the traditional role of the monarchy and to be seen to be relating to Australians and New Zealanders in the way that they're relating to people here, you know, to adapt that role and take on causes that would be beneficial for those countries and that they can help with, I think.
Yeah, there's that.
Prince William, his relationship with the armed forces, he completed 7.5 years of full-time military service, and since then he's been very much promoting the important role and the welfare of those who are serving or who have served their country in the armed forces as a key focus, particularly when it comes to his charitable activities. And Ian, perhaps you could explain to us the medals that the Prince of Wales is wearing there.
Yeah, I mean, they're not just the medals aren't always automatically given for service for fighting. They're also given for ceremonial reasons, and the medals that he's wearing there would undoubtedly have been given to him by the Queen to commemorate the Golden Jubilee, the Diamond Jubilee in 2012, and the Platinum Jubilee earlier this year. And Harry has a set, and all the members of the royal family, the working members of the royal family, would have been given them as well. So it's to commemorate the key events in the Queen's reign.
We were talking about the importance of the armed forces to the royal family, and there will be vigils held inside Westminster Hall by senior royals tonight at around 7:30. The King will be joined by his siblings, and we understand from the palace that Prince Andrew has been given discretionary permission special dispensation to wear his military uniform, should he so wish. It's going to be a personal choice of Prince Andrew. And then on Saturday evening, we have the Queen's grandchildren, all 8 of them, taking part in their own vigil. Again, Prince Harry, we understand, is being given dispensation to wear his military uniform. Symbolic, yes, but also of personal importance to Prince Andrew and Prince Harry, who both served.
Yeah, absolutely, and they're in a position where they're both separated from the royal family, so this is bringing them back in the fold, so to speak. I think Prince Andrew definitely would want that. There was rumours that he spent time at Balmoral earlier this summer with the Queen, trying to talk about his future role, and there are suggestions that his 2 daughters, Beatrice and Eugenie, tried to bend the ear of the new king to try and say, look, you know, what can we do about Daddy? He needs a role, because he's effectively almost a former member of the royal family because he's no longer working. And we saw it in the summer with the Troop in the Colour ceremony, which he would normally take part in, and he was effectively banned from that. So it's a very tricky situation. The new king has got to sort out what to do about his brother, and also what to do about Harry, although Harry has forged a new life in America, and King Charles, I beg your pardon, in his speech wished them well, didn't he, in their future in America.
If you're just joining us here on Sky News, we're looking at live pictures from an Army training base, Pirbright in Surrey. The new Prince and Princess of Wales are there meeting soldiers from Canada, Australia and New Zealand, soldiers from across the Commonwealth who have been deployed to the UK to take part in Monday's state funeral. They are there in Surrey to rehearse their parts in Monday's state funeral, a funeral that will involve thousands of military personnel. Ian, in terms of a spectacle, this will be quite something. It's going to be beamed around the world, millions of people watching. And as I said, thousands of armed personnel involved, the pomp and the ceremony, everything that is typically British will be on display. And the plans have been decades in the making. And the execution, we expect, will be quite something to watch.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I've been surprised at the involvement of the Commonwealth troops, although obviously, as we talked about, the Queen was head of state of Australia, New Zealand and Canada and so on. But the funerals that we've experienced, certainly in my lifetime, with the Queen Mother and Diana, didn't have that element. And we have to go back really to the coronation of the Queen in 1953, when Commonwealth troops were brought over to this country. And it was interesting, that's how Prince Philip developed the use of the Royal Helicopter, which the Prime Minister Winston Churchill tried to ban him from using, but Philip found it a very efficient way of getting around the country to visit these various groups from across the world that had come over. But it's almost a sort of spectacle in the way that the coronation is, but obviously not a celebration, but a commemoration.
Just looking at the Prince of Wales, they're talking to representatives from the armed forces in Canada. And what we've been commenting on today, Ian, is the amount of time that senior royals are giving those that they are speaking to over the last few days, given it is a difficult and a busy time. They are in no rush. Events in Wales have run over today, because the new king wanted to take his time for everyone that had turned out to see him, whether they be dignitaries or members of the public. And you're very much getting a sense of this here in Surrey. Normally, with a visit such as this, you have somebody at their elbow, gently nudging them along to keep them to time. There's no sense of this here. Prince William, for example, has been speaking to this group of soldiers for the last 5 minutes. There is no sense of urgency.
No, I don't. I think they don't want it to appear that they're ticking boxes, that they're just doing this to because they have to or they should do. What's coming across in the last few days is that they're doing this thing of involving people, whether it's members of the public or the armed forces or the visiting heads of state. They're doing it because they feel very much that it's appropriate, that they want to do it. And as we were saying earlier, I think both sides are helping each other. I think they're probably getting a lot back from... we can't hear what these people are saying at the moment, but I bet they're saying supportive things about the Queen and about the King and about William's involvement. So it's a very nice thing. And when you look back at the beginning of the Queen's reign, the late Queen's reign, there was a great element of formality. If you look at photographs of her meeting people, whether it's at film premieres or the armed forces, there's great distance. The Queen will hold her arm out and they will hold their arm out. There's quite a few feet between them. But it's been interesting, this kind of touchy-feely monarchy that we've seen in the last few days. It's again, a modern departure.
Yeah, we can expect to see more of that over the weekend until Monday. Monday, of course, when ceremony and tradition will be played out in full. And you were telling me a tale earlier on about the Queen. And in terms of the Queen, didn't travel to funerals for heads of state or members of the royal family around the world. She preferred private reflection, and you told a lovely story about her actually going out in disguise almost in the crowd to pay her respects at a funeral.
Yeah, that was the funeral of Field Marshal Montgomery of El Alamein, the wartime army leader who died, I think, in 1969. And the funeral was at St George's, like the Queen's. The Queen wasn't at the funeral and she wasn't represented. Well, she probably was represented, but she didn't attend the funeral. So what she did, she was living at Windsor at the time, is she put on a headscarf and went into the town of Windsor and stood with the public behind a barrier, just watching Montgomery's body pass by. And as you said, with overseas, I mean, she only went to one, as far as I know, which was King Baudouin of Belgium in 1993. She never really also attended ones for family or friends because, well, sorry, I beg your pardon, family, yes, but not friends necessarily, because I think she thought her presence was a disruption. So quite often she went to memorial services for friends, but not the funeral. But certainly in terms of a head of state, she only went to one, as far as I know.
Well, if you're just joining us, the Prince and Princess of Wales are visiting an army training base in Surrey this afternoon. Troops from across the Commonwealth, Canada, New Zealand and Australia have been based there to carry out rehearsals for Monday's state funeral. William and Kate taking their time to speak to people there. As we alluded to, no rush. We haven't got any sound on the pictures at the moment. We did catch snippets earlier on. There was a reference made to somebody speaking 5 languages. And of course, a mention of rugby. Of course, Prince William, a big rugby fan. I'm sure he has a few stories to swap with the soldiers from New Zealand and Australia about that. Let's see if we can listen in.
Once the police comes out, everyone starts running away. That dreaded police.
Get one and talk, so they get told to come to the R6 minutes. Much anything that you're doing for these processes of which I said, maybe
it's always easy for us to everyone loves that. But I think you see that's an improvement.
I was in the 5 years as a steward.
We are watching those live pictures from Surrey of the Princess of Wales, talking to some of the female personnel from the Commonwealth troops that have been brought to the UK to play their part in Monday's state funeral. Joining us now in the studio, Kate Williams, royal historian. Kate, so much has happened over the last few days. There's still so much more to happen before the state funeral on Monday. It's important to take a moment, isn't it, and just try and take it all in, the enormity, historically, of what we're witnessing unfold in real time.
Yes, the enormity. As you say, I mean, very few of us have ever seen a state funeral. We had Winston Churchill's in 1965, and some people remember that, but of course that wasn't the royal state funeral, that was an exception. The main royal state funerals we've seen were for Edward VII and George V and George VI, the Queen's father, grandfather, great-grandfather. So I think very few people remember the funeral for George VI in 1952. Many people remember the Queen's coronation, but not so much that. And this is such a huge moment. It is a moment by which we give thanks for the Queen's 70-year reign, but also really the enormity of this historical moment for us. 1952, 2022, how much Britain, how much the world has changed in 70 years. And as you've been talking about, that there will be change to come. There is going to be change to the Commonwealth, probably change to the different constituents, the different parts of different countries that have the Queen as head of state. And we are in a sort of moment of great historical change. And I think the future will look back on this moment 100, 200 years' time and really see it as a defining moment for Britain.
Well, we're looking at part of the immediate future of the royal family, the Prince and Princess of Wales, their new titles. They're getting used to it. They've had them for a few days now. And the King, Kate, you'll have been following his progress today. He was in Wales, in Cardiff, and he got a huge reception there. There had been some talk about not knowing whether the crowds would be as big in Wales to turn out to see the new King as they had been in, say, Edinburgh or London. Talk us through the history of the royal family and its association with Wales, how it's poised at the moment.
Yes, the Prince was saying, the King was saying what a privilege it had been to be Prince of Wales for so long. He spoke bilingually, he spoke in Welsh.
He spoke in Welsh first.
He spoke in Welsh first, and of course spent some time in Wales learning Welsh as well. And it's a language that he was keen to learn, and it's always had a place in his heart. And he talked about the listening when he visited the Senate and the Welsh Parliament, and was having heard your heartfelt words. I know we all share the deepest commitment to the welfare of the people of this land, and talked about how committed his mother was to Wales as well. And Wales has always been such a special place to the royal family, but in a different way to Scotland. There is not an equivalent of Balmoral there in the same way, and certainly the crowds have been great, and I think there was a concern that they might not be as sort of overwhelming as they have been, but certainly there have been a lot of people who came out to see the new King. But Charles, has a road ahead in terms of the unity of the United Kingdom, and the unity of the United Kingdom, that's Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland.
And of course, Prince William and his wife assumed the title of Prince and Princess of Wales, and of course they have an association with Wales, having lived in Anglesey before Prince William was elevated to a much more public status within the royal family. They had that private time there, so there's that connection as well, Kate. But I just want to look ahead to the state funeral on Monday. We've been getting more details about it. We've had some details about the route, actually, after the Queen leaves Westminster Abbey. We'll bring you some details of that a little bit later. But what can we expect from a state funeral? Can you give us some things to look out for? Because as you said, most of us will have never seen a state funeral before. This will be the first experience of it. the majority of us are going to look at it on our TV screens and be able to see every moment and every movement and really soak it all up. So what should we be looking out for?
Yes, it's going to be a huge moment. And just as you were saying there on Wales, the love for the royal family. And it's interesting, one interesting point is that the Queen was never Princess of Wales. We don't have a name in the British royal family for an heir to the throne who is female. So she was never Princess of Wales, whereas, of course, now William is Prince of Wales in Anglesey, my father's home, my father's birthplace, beautiful part of the world. And the state funeral, many of us have never seen this. We remember ceremonial funerals for the Queen Mother, for Princess Diana, and for the Duke of Edinburgh, which was restricted due to COVID. The key difference in a state funeral and a ceremonial funeral is that the gun carriage bearing the coffin is pulled forward by not horses, but by servicemen. And that's what's going to happen. We're going to see it being pulled forward by Royal Navy servicemen. That is the key difference. But there are many great differences and many sort of smaller differences because the monarch makes their own choice. As you were just talking about, the role of the Commonwealth troops is very significant. And this is the first state funeral we have had in Westminster Abbey since the 18th century. They've generally been at St George's Chapel, Windsor, and that really reflects the scale of the event. So many world leaders are already here. We were just talking about Jacinda Ardern is already here, the Prime Minister of Australia is already here, and Joe Biden, we think, probably is coming over or is already over, we don't know. And there are so many world leaders, world royals, and it's so poignant, isn't it, to me, that the Queen began her reign. She was crowned at Westminster Abbey. She, of course, was married at Westminster Abbey just a few years before. She was crowned at Westminster Abbey in 1953, and now she will end her reign in Westminster Abbey as well.
You're watching pictures live from Surrey. The Prince and Princess of Wales there greeting troops from the Commonwealth who are based at their Army Training Camp for the next few days as part of rehearsals for the state funeral on Monday. Ian Lloyd, royal biographer, is in the studio with myself and Kate Williams, the historian. And Kate there mentions the gun carriage. Apologies if you can hear some noise above us. That is a rather large aircraft going over the studio. It's actually making the studio shake. I haven't got eyes on yet. It feels and sounds like a Chinook, but I'm no expert. I'm just waiting for it to come into view. But Ian, Kate there referenced oh, let's just pause because the haka is being carried out by troops from New Zealand. Well, that was members of the New Zealand Army performing the haka, the ceremonial dance in Maori in Her Majesty's memory for the Princess and Prince of Wales. Here at Buckingham Palace, the Royal Standard has been raised. King Charles is due to arrive back in Buckingham Palace. The loud sound you heard here in the studio may well have been his helicopter landing close by. But the Prince and Princess of Wales there in Surrey, speaking to troops from the Commonwealth, Canada, New Zealand and Australia, thanking them for their part in marking the passing of the late Queen and talking to them about the rehearsals that have been ongoing for days now and will continue right up until Monday and that state funeral. And Ian, just before we went to the haka there, we were talking about something Kate mentioned that's a key part of a state funeral, and that is the gun carriage that will carry the Queen, and it is pulled not by horses, but by members of the armed forces. And there's a story behind that, how it came to be part of tradition.
Yeah, I believe it was at Queen Victoria's funeral in 1901, and they were at Windsor Station waiting to take the Queen's body on a gun carriage up the hill, Castle Hill, to St George's Chapel, when the horses sort of bolted and the traces, the leather connection to the gun carriage were broken, and I think there was a moment of panic, and then somebody very sensibly suggested that the cadets from Eton who were lining the route could possibly pull the gun carriage, which they did, and it became one of those moments in a royal ceremony that would take us by surprise, a new departure that, and it was so popular and caught the imagination of the public that ever since, when the monarch dies, the naval ratings pull the cortege, you know. So,
and Kate, we've been talking about the pomp, the ceremony, the tradition that we are witnessing, and something that has emerged from the monarch's death is the idea of vigil. Now, it was called the Prince's Vigil, I understand, and we saw the Princess Royal take part in the vigil in Edinburgh. There will be another one held by her children tonight in Westminster Hall, and then tomorrow night her grandchildren will stand vigil with Her Majesty. And it's interesting, not just because female members of the royal family are taking part, but members of the royal family who do not have royal titles as well. It's a real changing of tradition as we go.
Yes, it really reminds us that the Queen, monarchy, the huge monarchy outside Buckingham Palace here, and but really at the heart of it was one person, and she was a mother, a grandmother and a great-grandmother, and it really is very meaningful, very significant. It really reflects Anne's role in the family and the Queen's real trust for Anne, that Anne played this key role. She accompanied the Queen from Balmoral to Edinburgh. She accompanied her on the plane from Edinburgh to RAF Brize Norton, and then now she's walking behind the coffin and also in the Vigil of the Princes. And it really reflects, I think, it looks like Charles arriving there. Is it coming in?
That's right. That's it looks like King Charles and the Queen Consort at Buckingham Palace. We're just waiting for the car to come through the gates there.
So I presume they've landed and they're off to Clarence House. Charles and Camilla, I think Charles and the Queen Consort were heading from Buckingham Palace to Clarence House, so the crowds are delighted. They've been waiting here all day. They've caught their glimpse of the King, and he's returning to Clarence House because I believe I think this is right, isn't it, Ian, that he hasn't quite moved into Buckingham Palace yet. Monarchs are supposed to move into Buckingham Palace, but of course it's a transition. They have a home there. They have to try. It took the Queen when her father became king quite a time to move into, quite a few months before they moved from their townhouse in Piccadilly to Buckingham Palace. So it's a process. So they're heading back to Clarence House now.
Do they have to move into Buckingham Palace? Because the Queen hadn't lived there for a couple of years. During COVID, she officially, well,
she had her bubble in Windsor Castle.
Buckingham Palace is her official residence. But she made the decision to stay at Windsor. So does King Charles have to take up the official residence?
They usually live there, but it is Monarchy HQ, isn't it? It's not a home, it's an office. It's sort of a giant office. There are 775 rooms. It is the working heart of monarchy. So many people rather prefer their other residences that they perhaps can be a bit more intimate with family and friends. And certainly, but I think Charles will be using it so frequently for state occasions, for the occasions that he must be at, that he probably will eventually move in and at least have rooms there. But certainly they're very fond of Clarence House, but luckily it's just around the corner.
So the plans, I think, 1949, wasn't it, when the Queen moved in there, Princess Elizabeth, they'd only just been married a couple of years, and it had been redecorated with their choice, hadn't it? Philip and the Queen, as Princess Elizabeth and Duke of Edinburgh, they'd decorated it, and they wanted to stay there. And it was Winston Churchill
doing all the DIY. I think the Duke loved doing all the DIY and the renovations.
Well, I think she did. I think they chose the wallpaper and the curtains and everything, and then it was Winston Churchill that put his foot down and said, "To the palace they will go." You know, there's a story about Philip's private secretary, Mike Parker, saying the four of them went in a car and there wasn't a dry eye in the car as they went to Buckingham Palace. They hated the idea. And it's such a shame when you think about it.
It's interesting, isn't it? We've done so many royal events here, and often after we've seen the Queen do a royal event and be on the balcony, we're all still here just packing up, and then the Queen's car is heading off to Windsor. So certainly it's not many people's favourite royal residence, as beautiful and majestic as it is, but Charles will spend a lot of time there. He has to.
Well, the Prince and Princess of Wales are seemingly wrapping up their visit in Surrey. Let's just listen in and see if we can catch a few words of what's being said. Well, that is the Prince and Princess of Wales leaving the Army Training Centre at Pirbright in Surrey, having greeted troops from the Commonwealth, Canada, New Zealand and Australia, taking a little break from their rehearsals. Well, I say taking a break. There were rehearsals ongoing as that audience with the Prince and Princess of Wales was taking place. I've got Kate Williams, the royal historian, and Ian Lloyd, the royal biographer, in the studio with me. I've just had a statement in from the Earl of Wessex that I will read, and we can react to that. This is the first public statement we've had from the Earl of Wessex, Prince Edward. He said, "As a family, we have grown up learning to share our parents, especially our beloved Mama, with the nation, her realms and the Commonwealth. While it has been lovely to have spent time saying our own farewell privately at Balmoral, it is now time to allow others to be able to say their farewell. We have been overwhelmed by the tide of emotion that has engulfed us and the sheer number of people who have gone out of their way to express their own love, admiration and respect to such a very special and unique person who was always there for us. And now we are there for her, united in grief. Thank you for your support. You have no idea how much it means. The Queen's passing has left an unimaginable void in all our lives. Sophie and I have taken huge pleasure in seeing our James and Louise enjoying the places and activities that their grandparents love so much. Given that my mama let us spend so much time with her, I think she also rather enjoyed watching those passions blossom. Those times together, those happy memories, have now become massively precious to each and every one of us. May God bless Her Majesty, and may her memory be long cherished, even as the baton she has carried for these past 70 years now passes to the next generation and to my brother Charles. Long live the King." That's a statement from the Earl of Wessex and Forfar. Ian, just your reaction to that. We were talking earlier about the new monarchy, and we're seeing the Earl of Wessex here in Manchester yesterday. He was there with the Countess of Wessex, Sophie, about them being much more open emotionally. It's a new generation. We're all a new generation from when the Queen started her reign, and that was a very emotional statement.
Absolutely, it's really heartfelt, and there's been such a change, certainly in my lifetime. I mean, at the beginning of the Queen's reign, for a start, I don't think they issued statements about loss of a member of the royal family, but the Queen's early speeches and declarations were incredibly formal, even, you know, when she was crowned in 1953 and they issued one from Buckingham Palace. It was very, very uptight, very formal. I mean, this is incredible. And also even the way they refer to themselves, you know, Sophie and the children, James and Louise.
Yeah,
and so
our
on.
James and
Our
Louise.
James and Louise.
No allusion to their royal
even the Queen in the
titles.
last year, there's been a change, hasn't there? The last couple of years when she referred to Philip rather than my late husband, my beloved Duke of Edinburgh or something. There really is a change, a thought that to make the royal family less sort of elitist, but part of the greater family of the country, I think.
I think the passing of Diana had a really cataclysmic effect on how the royal family saw themselves, because they'd always felt that they should be restrained and leave their tears to others, and that really, at the moment of Diana's death, that seemed like aloofness, that seemed like stiffness. And so the Queen really, when she came on and gave that address just before Diana's funeral and talked as a grandmother and praised Diana's gifts and really gave this very emotional speech within the parameters of mourning, gave a very emotional speech. And I think that really, lots of people talk about Diana's death sort of ending the stiff upper lip for Britain. I've seen lots of articles on that. But I think also for the royal family, really it showed them that if you don't sort of acknowledge the grief, and really people are sort of not happy, but people are sort of very accepting to hear about your own grief. I think maybe royals before had felt it was selfish to talk about their own grief, but now they feel that they can do, and people will find that not selfish and not at all. Instead, really sort of joining together, as we do when we lose someone, we gain sort of heart from being together and being sort of